The final balance changes for August were just announced a few hours ago. There are 11 cards getting balanced, which is actually 4 more than the ones that were in the work in progress balance changes. So I'm going to show you guys all the balances, talk about my opinion on them, and then afterwards show the opinion of the Clash Royale community if people think they are good or not. Okay guys, so the first nerf is the arrows. I already talked about this in the work in progress balance change video I did a few days ago, but in case you guys didn't see it, the arrows are going to do 16% less damage to towers. So instead of dealing 111, it's going to deal 93, but it's still going to deal the same amount of damage to units. I like this nerf because arrows have been one of the best spells in the game for a very long time, incredibly versatile, and this will help tone them down a little bit. The second balance change, and this one is actually new, they decided to give a nerf to the Evolve Goblin Drill. This wasn't on the work in progress balance changes, but a lot of people in the community were complaining that the Evolve Drill is too broken, which I agree with, so they decided to make the spawn units from the second spawn minus 50%, which means instead of 2 goblins coming out of the second spawn of the drill, it's only going to be 1. I don't really think this is a massive nerf, but it's definitely going to help tone it down a bit, and I think it's pretty good overall. Now here's what's very interesting, guys. This is new as well. They decided to include an Evolve Wizard rework. I personally can't even tell if this is a buff or a nerf because the Evolve Wizard shield is being reduced by 36%, going from 296 all the way to 190, which means the shield will be able to be taken off by things like the log now. So instead of having to use something like arrows that deal more damage, log and I believe even bar barrel will be able to take the shield off of the Evolve Wizard. But they're buffing the regular wizard hit points by 5%, going from 720 to 754, which is why this wizard buff actually kind of goes hand in hand with the Evolve Wizard rework, because technically the Evolve Wizard, a big part of it is the regular wizard, because once the shield's off, you have that regular wizard. And essentially, with the wizard having 5% more health, the main interaction that changes is poison is no longer going to be enough to kill the wizard. So that is going to be one big thing you notice, and probably a few other interactions as well. And as I've mentioned before, the cannon cart is getting a buff of 11% to its hit speed. So it's going from 1 to 1.11, which I think overall is a good buff because the cannon cart has been pretty weak for a decent amount of time now. This is the same buff as before too that I already mentioned, and I like it as well. It's a 20% increase to the Electro Wizard spawn radius, going from 2.5 tiles to 3 tiles. I think it's a buff that'll help out the card, but maybe it would have been a little better to buff something like the damage it deals, but I still think this will be helpful to the card, and the Electro Wizard has been a support card that hasn't been used as much as some other support cards, so it's just to try to help him be a little bit more viable in the meta. And for those of you guys who didn't see, the Goblin Machine is getting a buff. This one I definitely agree with because they went way too far with the nerf the Goblin Machine got. It essentially killed the card when they gave it 3 nerfs at once, back to back. So they decided to increase the rocket hit speed by 14%, going from 0.250 to 0.286. Personally, I still think it might be pretty bad after this, but at least it might help it be a little bit better and at least viable in at least one deck. The Hunter buff is slightly different than what it was in the work in progress balance changes. Before, it was only a 4% health buff. They decided to increase it by 1% because I guess they realized 4% was hardly anything and didn't change a lot of interaction. So now it's 5%, going from 838 to 884, and I'm okay with this one for sure because the Hunter, just like the Electro Wizard, not really used much as a support card because there's a lot better options, and now it's going to make him a little bit more likely to be played in more decks. And this is another recap because it's the exact same. The Ice Wizard's getting a buff, splash radius increased by 50%, going from 1 to 1.5 tiles. I honestly think this is a perfect buff to the Ice Wizard because I felt like he really was lacking in the amount of splash radius he dealt. So now it's going to make him way better against swarms that he struggled against. And then, as I mentioned before, the Void is getting a rework, but I think it's overall a small nerf. The main strike is dealing 13% less damage, going from 544 to 472. So it's going to change some interactions. Like, for example, it's no longer going to be able to one-shot things like a Magic Archer and a Mother Witch. It's going to require 2 strikes now. But the multiple strikes at once, for example, when you play it on things like skeletons or bats, it's going to be dealing more damage when you play it on the weaker units when there's multiple strikes. So there's a 58% increase going from 48 to 76, which means it's going to be better against units when they're clumped together. But I think overall this is a nerf because people tend to use the Void on one unit that has a lot of health to get the most amount of value out of it. And lastly, guys, the Skeleton Dragons, this one is kind of interesting. It's technically getting a small nerf, but they call it a bug fix because the Skeleton Dragon nerf is a bug fix for interaction consistency across all levels. So previously, a level 11 wizard needed 3 hits to kill level 11 skeleton dragons, but a level 15 wizard takes only 2 hits to kill a level 15 skeleton dragon. So after the value adjustments, both wizards will take 2 hits to kill a same level skeleton dragon. So what this means is the skeleton dragons have 1% less health, going from 563 to 560. Now, probably the main interaction this changes is, of course, the wizard. It's technically another indirect buff to the wizard, which already got a buff. The regular wizard did, so that's another thing that's good for the wizard because skeleton dragons are pretty decent. Now, I don't know if there's any other interactions that change. I mean, 1% can tend to affect more than you would expect in the game, but likely this is hardly going to change anything, so it doesn't really probably matter that much, but definitely worth mentioning because it technically is a balance change regardless. Now let's see what people in the community think of these changes and if there were any that were missing. Okay, here we go. Let's see what some people in the community think of these balance changes. I heavily disagree with the wizard hit points buff. I think it could get a spawn damage buff, but not hit points. So I guess he's saying it should get a spawn damage buff, kind of like the Electro Wizard did, for example, or giving it one in the first place because the Wizard currently doesn't even have one like the Electro Wizard and the Ice Wizard do. So it would actually make it consistent if it has one like the other wizards do. So I guess that's actually not a bad idea now that I think about it. Invader here says ridiculous wizard buff no longer dies to poison. Well, that's probably the idea of why they purposely gave it that health buff so it doesn't die to poison. But you could definitely make the argument that giving the wizard that buff cancels out the Evolve Wizard nerf. So now the Evolve Wizard is just as good as it was before it's going to get this nerf because, well, the wizard itself is stronger, and now the regular wizard might actually be somewhat meta, which could be interesting as well if we see the regular wizard used without even the evolution. Nate here said Donald the Goat. That's the guy who's in charge of the balance changes now. Now buff Dark Prince next balance change. Honestly, a Dark Prince buff seems like it could be fair to me. It could get the same charge buff that the Prince got. That kind of makes it fair, I feel like, and consistent anyway, because I feel like it's kind of weird when they both have a different charge time when they're both princes. Can't wait for the booster Void and Evo Wizard players to never see top ladder again. Absolutely ridiculous players. Void needs a nerf, not a rework. Not sure about the Void rework, but the rest of the balances look great. Yeah, I kind of agree with that. Instead of the Void getting the weaker strike damage buff, maybe they could have just gave the main strike damage nerf and left it at that without adding a buff. I think that might have been better because it's broken enough to where I feel like they could have just given it a nerf. And someone here said, remember this comment when every pro is going to complain of how broken the cannon card is next season. I guess we'll see. I really don't think the cannon card's going to be broken, but it might be above average after this buff it's receiving, especially because the Void is pretty good against the cannon card, so that's kind of an indirect buff to the cannon card as well because of the Void getting nerfed. And then Too Good here said pretty cool balance changes. So I guess we'll end off with this. I think overall these balance changes are definitely pretty solid in comparison to a lot of the other ones we've gotten recently earlier this year that were pretty crappy. I personally like them, so I'm not really going to complain at all. Let me know in the comments below, what do you guys think of these balance changes? And if you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe. If you guys are not subscribed already, you can use creator code BOSS to support me in any Supercell game. And thanks again until next time, guys.